very much. Good afternoon. I'm very excited to be here to talk about the Parks Master Plan, which was just completed in August. As Marty said, WRT, my firm, worked with Crows Consulting, the Trust for Public Land, and ETC Institute on putting together the plan. And we were very happy to work with the Planning Department, the Parks and Recreation Department, and the Oklahoma City Community Foundation, and a number of stakeholders on putting together the plan. So on the screen you'll see the cover of the plan, and to the left of the screen you'll see the table of contents, so you have an understanding of what makes up the plan. And I'm going to quickly walk through it according to the order that things were in the plan and give you an overview of what was included in the plan. I want to thank the mayor for kind of setting me up with this, because he mentioned the Dunn Plan of 1910, which set up the 4 major corner parks in Oklahoma City. It was kind of the first big vision for the park system that were connected by the Grand Boulevard Loop. And if we look at what the size of Oklahoma City was in 1910, if you can see the little tiny gray splotch on the screen, and we compare it to the size of the Dunn Plan, you can see that the Dunn Plan actually went beyond the borders of the city and looked at how the city was going to grow and the parks that it was going to need. And if we fast forward to 2010, you see Oklahoma City, as you know, has grown both in population and in terms of size, land area. And so it's fitting that we need a new Parks Master Plan to take a look at how the park system is going to serve the population now and in the future. So the mission of the Parks Master Plan was to promote quality of life and economic viability by using great parks and public areas. And it should be for both citizens and visitors. The goals for the Parks Master Plan came from the planokc process for the Play OKC element, and it looks at having goals that ensure a healthy lifestyle, ensure accessibility with multiple modes of transit, looking at having recreational facilities and programs that match what people are looking for, making sure that the park system is funded and operated in the manner that it needs to be, and looking at public and private parks. Part of our process at the beginning was to take a look at the Oklahoma City park system and compare it to some of Oklahoma City's peer cities. And what we found out is that Oklahoma City does well in certain areas. For example, you're beating all of your peer cities in the number of skate parks that you have. But there's a lot of room for improvement, and there are a lot of lessons that can be learned from looking at peer cities. For example, you can see Kansas City actually scores very well compared to other peer cities. We looked at both amenities and in spending, and again, in spending, Oklahoma City does not spend as much on its park system per capita as other cities in the Midwest. Another piece of input that went into the Parks Master Plan was doing a community survey. And we surveyed 600 people randomly. It was a phone survey, a phone and mail survey. We also did online surveys. And I'm just going to share some highlights of the results from that survey. Not very surprisingly, a lot of people in Oklahoma City get to the parks that they use by driving, 90%. But there is a pretty big contingent of people who actually walk to parks, and the results of the survey seem to indicate that people don't walk to parks because they can't walk to parks. They don't find that there are sufficient parks and green space within walking distance of their home. There's very low participation in programming, and we found by asking people why they're not participating in programming that the main reason is they don't know what's being offered. So it's important to be able to tell people what's being offered so they can take advantage of those opportunities. Another really interesting finding is that 85% of people felt that quality parks are important in terms of quality life and healthy, active lifestyles, which is actually a much higher number than we see in other cities. And then another finding from the survey is that in order to have the parks and recreation opportunities that people want, nearly 2/3 of the people who responded to the survey said that they're willing to pay additional taxes or additional fees in order to make those a possibility. The last part that I want to talk about from the survey are priorities, and we looked at priorities in terms of priority parks and facilities, priority programs, and priority actions that the city can take. And you'll see right there at the top of the priority parks and facilities is walking and biking trails. This is something that we see almost universally across the country, that trails are the #1 thing that people are looking for in terms of their park system. And you'll see that that actually influences programs where you see that walking and biking groups are a program that people are looking for, and that building new walking and biking trails are an action that they'd like the city to take. But also important are making sure that existing neighborhood and community parks are kept up and maintained, and that they're meeting the needs of the communities. So coming out of all of the community survey input, looking at our benchmarking, talking with stakeholders, we ended up with 6 strategic directions that were prioritized by our group of stakeholders. #1 was to maintain and improve the physical assets that we already have. #2 was to develop facilities and programs that meet community needs. 3, improve access to existing parks. Promote awareness of the value of the park system. Develop new parks where needed. And establish agreements and standards for private parks and school parks. So thinking about what the park system is, we realize that the park system in Oklahoma City is not just the public parks, it's also the private parks. And so looking at the classification of parks that we have in Oklahoma City, we kind of group them into 3 categories. There are local parks, regional parks, and other parks. And this is for determining levels of service. But again, we included both public and private parks, so you'll see that school parks are included as local parks. So the park classifications in the master plan cover things like what's a typical size of a certain type of park, what's the typical length of visit, how should people be accessing the park, and what are the appropriate types of amenities. And to think about how the park system is going to serve the current population and the population of the future, I have a couple of maps up here that I just want to show you quickly. So this map shows the current population of Oklahoma City, and you can see the darker areas are the more heavily populated areas of the city, and you'll notice that most of the darker blue is toward the center of the city, the historic central part of the city. But if we look at where the projections of population are, the darker blue are the areas that are growing, and the lighter, like beige, reddish colors are the areas that are actually projected to decline. You'll notice that the areas where historically the population has been are the areas that are declining, and the areas at the fringe are the areas that are growing. And so that has implications, because obviously the existing park system is in the areas where the people currently are. And so how is the park system going to adapt and be able to serve the population of the future? So we looked at establishing level of service tiers so that the city, the citizens, private developers can all have a common understanding of what level of service can be expected in terms of the park system. And so there are 4 different tiers here that actually correspond with the level of service tiers that planokc is looking at in establishing levels of service for other city infrastructure and amenities. And so if we, so each of those level of service areas has a different level of service standard for local parks, regional parks, and trails. And the idea is to take advantage of all of the enormous amenity that you have in the current system, and then in areas that are growing where parks may not exist, thinking about trying to balance investment in new parks with the cost of what that's going to take to build and maintain. And so applying the standards that we developed to the city and its existing park system for local parks, we were looking at, well, how accessible is the current park system? And so for reference, the pink areas on this map are the areas that have high concentrations of population in the city. And if we look at how people can access current parks, the blue areas are where people have really good ability to walk to a park right now. So about 18% of the population can really walk easily to a park. If we look at If we expanded sidewalk access or created additional access points without building any new parks, we could actually increase the number of people who have really good access to parks. If we then look at how do school parks actually integrate into the park system, even more people would have great access to local parks without having to build any new additional parks. And then where there are still some gaps are areas that the city might consider taking a look at for building future parks. And the key takeaway here is that without having to build new parks, but by providing better access in terms of better access points or better sidewalks to make better connections to parks, you can more than double the number of people who have good access to local parks. So similarly, we did the same thing with the regional parks and the regional park standards. Again, this is the existing population and looking at where projected population growth is going to be. And actually, according to, looking at standards, Oklahoma City is very well served by regional parks. There are a couple of areas where if you were to provide better access by sidewalks, it would increase the number of people who have access. But there are still a couple of places that are missing that the city might consider taking a look at for new regional parks. So with regional parks, improving sidewalks, it doesn't have as big an impact, but it does have an impact. And then finally, looking at trails, looking at how those standards are applied. Again, the existing population and growth areas. Looking at the trails that are already in place, all of the areas in blue have great access to trails. If we then consider the trails that are planned and are being built, all of the areas in purple then have access to trails. And the pink lines are not meant to be prescriptive, but they're areas that the city might look at making better connections in the future to ensure that additional people have access to trails. And so taking all of these recommendations and putting them together, Russell mentioned having an implementation plan. The action plan part of the Parks Master Plan says, how are we going to implement the 6 strategic directions? And so for each of the 6 strategic directions, we have smaller actions that can move the park system in that direction, a rationale for that action that ties back to what we heard from citizens, that ties back to best practices and benchmarks, and then specific action steps that the city and its partners can take to implement the actions. We also then expand on that later in the plan and talk about what's the type of method that needs to be taken in order to implement. Is it a task? Is it a policy? Who are the responsible parties? Who's going to take the initiative to make this plan a reality? Who are potential partners? What are the potential funding sources for making this happen? Performance measures that the city can use to track progress, and also a suggested time frame, how long it's going to take to implement. The big question is how does this get funded? And so we compared Oklahoma City to other Midwestern cities. And like I mentioned before, comparing Oklahoma City to other cities, funding is actually much lower than other cities spend per capita on its park system. So we provided in the master plan a menu of funding sources for different things like acquisition, maintenance, and park and recreation facility operations, and recommend how to make the parks and recreation system more self-sufficient. So there are 3 different funding scenarios that are in the plan. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about them, but scenario A is what happens if we keep doing the same thing that we're doing, which means that there aren't a lot of improvements, but we see kind of a continuation of what we have. Scenario B accounts for a modest increase in spending, and scenario C accounts for the level of investment that's needed in order to take advantage of all of the actions that are in the Parks Master Plan. In terms of maintenance, the Oklahoma City has great maintenance standards. It really does come down to funding and whether the city has enough funding to keep up with those standards. Also, since we're looking at the park system as including both public and private parks, people use private parks, they expect a certain level of amenity and a certain level of maintenance. Private parks should be held to the same level of maintenance as public parks. And then finally, in order to really implement the plan, the city is going to have to really embrace partnerships. It already does a really great job in partnering with organizations for maintenance and for operating programs in parks. But there's even more that can be done in ensuring that the city and its partners both get an equal amount out of those partnerships. So there are a number of options that we talk about in the plan, including grouping all of the organizations that exist together and having kind of a unified entity for advocating for parks, looking at other conservancies like what's being done with Marriott Gardens, strengthening public partnerships. I mentioned earlier about the connection between parks and health, and there's a natural connection there between city departments like the health department. Also, there's an existing Oklahoma City Parks Foundation that's kind of dormant, but it would be great to have such a foundation that could fundraise and collect money for spending on parks, and working with advocacy groups. And through all these partnerships, the implementation of this plan could really lead to having an even more incredible park system for Oklahoma City. So thank you very much.